They were about to reject the multi-million-dollar contract until the janitor surprised them by speaking Chinese. Robert Johnson peered through the crack of the slightly open door at the growing tension in the 23rd floor conference room, a place he had never entered in his 15 years as a janitor. The Chinese executives were already on their feet, their faces scowling, clearly upset by something the translator had said. Briefcases snapped shut as the company's president, Michael Thompson, gestured desperately, trying to calm the storm. "This is an insult to our culture," shouted the oldest executive in broken English, his voice echoing down the hallway. Robert knew this deal was Thompson Technologies' last hope to avoid the bankruptcy, looming like an inevitable storm. For months, he had overheard tense conversations in elevators, witnessed mass layoffs, and felt the weight of the crisis on the weary faces of the remaining employees. But in that moment, something stirred inside him when he heard a specific Mandarin word the translator had completely butchered. Unable to hold back, Robert pushed the door open and stepped into the room, still wearing his navy blue uniform and yellow cleaning gloves. Everyone turned to him, startled by the unexpected interruption. In clear, confident Mandarin, he addressed the Chinese executives. "Forgive my intrusion, but there was a serious misunderstanding in the translation. The lady said you are Huojian, which means rockets, when Mr. Thompson meant to say Huoban, meaning partners. It's a difference that completely changes the proposal's meaning." The silence that fell over the room was so thick, Robert could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The Chinese executives exchanged glances, not just at the corrected translation, but at the flawless Beijing accent, coming from a man they had seen hundreds of times cleaning the halls, without ever speaking a word to him. The eldest of the group, a silver-haired man with golden glasses named Li Wei, took 2 steps forward and studied Robert with growing curiosity. The translator, a young woman of European appearance who charged $3,000 a day, paled as she realized the mistake that could have cost the company millions. "How do you know our language?" Li Wei asked in Mandarin, testing Robert's knowledge. "I studied for many years," Robert replied, keeping his head bowed respectfully. "And I apologize again for interrupting, but I couldn't let such a simple misunderstanding destroy something so important." Michael Thompson, a 52-year-old man who had always greeted Robert with a polite but distant nod, now stared at him open-mouthed. In 15 years, he had never imagined the quiet man who kept the building spotless could speak anything beyond English. Michael's daughter, Patricia Thompson, 35, and in charge of the company's international operations, recognized Robert as the janitor who left her office almost artistically organized every morning. She had noticed he always arranged Chinese documents differently from other papers, but had never thought much of it. "Mr. Michael hesitated, realizing he didn't even know the employee's full name. "Robert Johnson, Mr. Thompson." "Robert, do you really understand Chinese?" Before Robert could answer, another Chinese executive, younger and impatient, fired off a quick question in a Sichuan dialect. Robert responded effortlessly, explaining he had grown up in a community where that dialect was common. The answer made the 3 Chinese executives sit back down, their irritation replaced by curiosity. Li Wei asked to see Robert's hands. Hesitant, the janitor removed his yellow gloves and turned his palms upward. The executive examined the distinctive calluses formed by decades of practicing traditional Chinese calligraphy, a detail only someone familiar with the culture would recognize. "These calluses aren't from cleaning," Li Wei observed in hesitant English. "They're from brush and ink." Robert quickly lowered his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. The company's veteran secretary, Mrs. Jenkins, who had worked there for 25 years, watched everything from the doorway with a discreet smile. She was the only one who knew fragments of Robert's story, guarding the secret like a personal treasure all those years. "Could you all please continue the negotiations?" Robert tried to shift the focus. "The misunderstanding has been cleared up and I have work to do on the 15th floor." But Patricia, ever curious and direct like her father, wouldn't let the matter go. For years she had studied Mandarin without mastering even the basics, while here stood a man who spoke the language as if he'd been born in Beijing. "Robert, where did you learn Chinese?" "It's a long story, Miss Patricia." Li Wei interjected, speaking in Mandarin. "Time isn't an issue. We want to hear your story before continuing any negotiations. Robert sighed deeply, knowing there was no escape. For 15 years, he had built a simple, anonymous life, finding peace in the predictable routine of cleaning, organizing, and caretaking. Now it felt as though layers of skin he had taken so long to grow were being stripped away. "I was a professor," he finally said, still in Mandarin. "A university professor of linguistics at New York University." The murmurs that followed were inevitable. Michael sank heavily into his chair, trying to process the information. Patricia was already typing on her phone, searching for Robert's full name in academic databases. "Robert Johnson in Linguistics in NYU," she muttered as she scrolled through the results. When she found what she was looking for, she made a surprised noise. "Robert Johnson Smith, PhD in Applied Linguistics, Specialist in Sino-Tibetan Languages. Wow, you have over 50 published papers." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now back to the story. Robert closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a past he had tried to bury resurfacing like stubborn ghosts. Li Wei stepped closer and, in a respectful voice, said in Mandarin, "Professor Robert, why would a renowned academic work as a janitor?" Just then, the young Chinese executive Liu Chen received a call on his cell phone. After a few minutes of agitated conversation in Mandarin, he hung up and stared at Robert with growing astonishment. "My cousin studies linguistics at Beijing University," he said in careful English. "He knows your work. Your books on dialect evolution changed how we understand language." Robert lowered his head even further, as if he wanted to disappear. The mention of his books brought back memories he preferred to keep locked away. Patricia continued reading aloud the awards and academic recognitions she had found, creating an absurd contrast with the man in a blue uniform standing in the middle of the room. International Linguistics Award in 2008, honorary member of the Chinese Society of Linguistic Studies, official translator for diplomatic agreements between the United States and China. Patricia's voice trailed off as she noticed Robert's discomfort. Michael finally found his words. "Robert, I don't understand. How did someone with your qualifications end up here? Cleaning bathrooms?" Robert finished with a bitter smile. "Because sometimes life forces us to choose between sanity and a career." Li Wei, a wise 68-year-old man who had endured the Cultural Revolution in China, recognized the pain in Robert's eyes. In soft Mandarin, he asked, "What happened, Professor?" Robert took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back now. For 15 years, he had kept it a secret, speaking of it only with Mrs. Jenkins in moments of extreme vulnerability. "I lost my family," he said simply. "My wife Mary and my daughter Emily." His voice trembled. "A car accident. While I was in Beijing presenting research at a conference, they were on their way to pick me up at the airport when I returned." The silence that followed was different from before. It was heavy with compassion and understanding. Liu Chen, who had a young daughter, felt tears in his eyes. Li Wei bowed his head in respect for another's suffering. "It was my fault," Robert continued, now mixing English and Mandarin without realizing it. "If I hadn't traveled, if I had just taken a taxi from the airport." The funeral was 3 days later. I couldn't set foot in the university again. I couldn't bear to see students Emily's age. I couldn't even hear Mandarin without remembering the last conversation I had with Mary on the phone from Beijing. Patricia, a mother of 2 young children, brought a hand to her chest. Mrs. Jenkins quietly entered the room and stood beside Robert, as she had done so many times when she found him crying in the storage room during those early years. "I left everything," Robert went on. "My apartment, my books, my research. I just took a suitcase and walked away. When the money ran out, I took the first job I could find. I was a janitor in a small building on the Upper East Side. I discovered that cleaning was therapy. I didn't have to think, just do. After 5 years, I came here." Li Wei stood and gave a formal bow, surprising everyone. In Chinese tradition, showing respect in this way to someone who had suffered a family loss was a gesture of deep consideration. "Professor Robert, You found wisdom in simplicity that is highly valued in our culture. I'm not a professor anymore. Robert shook his head. I'm just Robert the janitor, and I like it that way. Michael was visibly moved. For 15 years, one of the country's greatest experts in Chinese languages had worked in the halls of his company, and he had never known. Worse, he had treated Robert with the polite distance reserved for lower-ranking employees. Robert, I don't know what to say. All these years... They were good years, Mr. Thompson. I found peace here. I don't want anything to change. Liu Chen, however, was thinking about the negotiation. He turned to Li Wei and said something in Mandarin that made the older man smile for the first time that day. Professor Robert, Li Wei said, we have a proposal for you. I'm not a professor anymore. To us, once a professor, always a professor. We want your help with the negotiation, not as a company employee, but as a cultural consultant. We respect your life choice, but we need someone who truly understands our language and culture. Robert looked at Michael, who nodded immediately. The proposal was unusual, but if it meant saving the company... Can I keep working as a janitor? Of course, Li Wei smiled. In China, we say true nobility comes from character, not position. And so began one of the most unlikely partnerships in American corporate history. Robert agreed to help with the negotiation, but only during his free time, keeping his cleaning routine intact. To him, those quiet halls on the 23rd floor became a different place, filled with memories both painful and redemptive. Over the following weeks, the company's dynamics changed completely. Employees who had barely noticed Robert before now greeted him with exaggerated respect, something that made him deeply uncomfortable. He preferred it when he was invisible, when he could do his work in peace without the weight of others' expectations. But the negotiations required his presence. Li Wei had discovered that Robert not only mastered Mandarin, but understood cultural nuances that made all the difference in business. When disagreements arose over contract terms, Robert explained the cultural meaning behind the words, facilitating agreements that seemed impossible. During one of these sessions, Patricia watched how Robert worked. He didn't just translate words, he built bridges between two completely different mindsets. When the Chinese mentioned guanxi, the concept of lasting business relationships, Robert explained to Michael that it wasn't just about contracts, but about trust built over generations. It's like when my grandmother did business in the countryside, Robert explained. A handshake was worth more than any signed paper. For the Chinese, it's similar, but on an industrial scale. Li Wei was impressed by the analogy. During a break, he confessed to Robert in Mandarin, "You understand our culture better than many Chinese who live abroad." "I spent 20 years studying not just the language, but the soul of it," Robert replied. "Mary always said I lived more in China than in the United States." The mention of his wife brought a melancholic silence. Li Wei, a father of 4, understood the depth of Robert's loss. In Chinese tradition, family was sacred, and losing a wife and daughter was an almost unthinkable tragedy. "You honor their memory by continuing to use the knowledge you gained," Li Wei said. "In our culture, we believe knowledge never dies if it's shared." Robert nodded, but a lump still formed in his throat whenever the topic touched on his lost family. For 15 years, he had avoided anything that reminded him of his past life. Now he was being forced to confront that past daily. One day, while cleaning Patricia's office after a particularly tense meeting, she approached him. "Robert, can I ask you a personal question?" He stopped organizing the papers and looked at her. Patricia had always been kind to him, but now there was something different in her eyes, a curiosity mixed with admiration that made him uncomfortable. "Of course, Mrs. Patricia. Don't you miss teaching, doing research?" Robert considered the question carefully. For years he had suppressed any academic nostalgia, treating it like a toothache that needed to be ignored. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but teaching was part of a life that doesn't exist anymore. It was part of Robert, married to Mary, father to Emily. That Robert disappeared in that accident. But the knowledge is still there." Patricia pointed to his head. "And it's helping save our company. It's different, I'm just translating, I'm not teaching anyone. You're teaching all of us about a culture we didn't understand. Robert finished organizing the documents and prepared to leave, but Patricia wasn't done. "Robert, can I suggest something?" He turned, curious despite himself. "How about teaching Chinese to our employees, informally, after hours? With these negotiations, we've realized we need to understand Chinese culture better, and you could teach better than any hired professor." The suggestion hit Robert like a punch to the gut. Teaching again meant reviving memories he had buried, confronting the person he used to be. "I don't know if I can," he said honestly. "Think about it. You don't have to decide now." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. And now continuing. That night, Robert returned to his simple apartment on the Upper East Side with his mind racing. It was a modest place, just the essentials for an unassuming life. But on the shelves, stored in dusty boxes, were the remnants of his former life. Books, diplomas, photos with academic colleagues. He hadn't opened those boxes in years, but the conversation with Patricia had stirred something he preferred to keep buried. With trembling hands, he opened the first box and found a photo of his doctoral class. There he was, 20 years younger, smiling beside classmates who had become renowned professors at universities around the world. In the second box, he found letters from former students, some in Mandarin, others in English, all thanking him for lessons that had changed their lives. One letter, written on traditional rice paper, was from a student who had become a diplomat at the Chinese embassy. Robert remembered him, a shy young man who stuttered when speaking Mandarin in his first semester. "Professor Robert," the letter read, "your classes didn't just teach me a language, they opened a new way of seeing the world. Today, I work building bridges between our countries, and it all began in that first class where you taught us that language isn't just vocabulary, but the soul of a people." Robert sat on the bed, holding the letter carefully. He had completely forgotten that phrase, one he used to repeat to every new class. Language isn't just vocabulary, but the soul of a people. It was his teaching philosophy, his way of helping students understand that learning Mandarin meant immersing themselves in millennia of history and culture. But remembering the phrase also brought back other memories. Mary attending his lectures as an observer, even without understanding a word of Mandarin, just to be near him. Emily, at 5 years old, pretending to speak Chinese by making sounds she thought resembled the language. The two of them would pick him up from the university every day, turning his academic routine into precious family moments. When the phone rang, Robert was silently crying, surrounded by memories he had kept locked away for so long. It was Mrs. Jenkins. "Robert, dear, are you all right? I saw you left the company looking down today." Mrs. Jenkins had become his emotional anchor during the hardest years. A 62-year-old woman, widowed for 10, she understood the pain of loss intimately. She had been the first person Robert told his story to on a particularly difficult day when he'd found a family photo in the pocket of an old jacket. "I've been going through some old things, Jenkins. Patricia suggested I teach Mandarin to the employees. And will you?" "I don't know, I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" Robert hesitated. How could he explain the fear of reviving an identity that had died with his family? How could he explain that teaching meant being Robert Johnson Smith again, not just Robert Johnson, the janitor? "Afraid of missing them too much," he finally said. "Dear, you already miss them. The difference is now you can do something positive with it." Mrs. Jenkins's simple wisdom always surprised him. For 15 years, she had been his confidant, his substitute family, the person who had stopped him from giving up on life entirely in his darkest moments. "Jenkins, what if I can't do it? What if it's too hard?" "Then you stop and go back to cleaning. No one will judge you for trying." After hanging up, Robert stayed awake late into the night, flipping through old notebooks. He found lesson plans written with care, creative exercises for teaching Mandarin tones, educational games he'd invented to make learning more fun. Every page was a window to a version of himself he'd thought was lost forever. The next day he arrived at work earlier than usual and went straight to Patricia's office. "Mrs. Patricia, about yesterday's proposal." She looked up from her computer screen, hopeful. "I can teach, but with a few conditions." "Of course, go ahead." First, I keep working as the janitor. The classes would just be an extra activity. Second, if at any point I feel I can't continue, I stop without explanations. Third, it has to be voluntary. I don't want to be paid for it. Patricia smiled widely. I accept all your conditions. When can we start? How about next week? Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays after work. Perfect. I'll let the interested people know. When the news spread through the company, the response was surprising. 15 employees signed up for the classes, from the young accounting intern to the sales supervisor who dreamed of doing business in Asia. Robert spent the weekend preparing teaching materials, a task he hadn't done in 15 years. It felt strange writing on the board for the first time since the accident, but he also rediscovered a long-forgotten sense of purpose. The first class was scheduled for Monday at 6 in the evening in the training room on the 18th floor. Robert arrived an hour early, arranged the chairs in a semicircle and wrote on the board, "Ni hao, 欢迎来到中文课." Hello, welcome to Mandarin class. As the students began to arrive, Robert felt a nervous flutter in his stomach, something he hadn't experienced since his early days as a university professor. But when he saw their eager, curious, and respectful faces, something inside him settled. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "My name is Robert, and over the next few months I'll try to teach you not just Mandarin words, but a little about the soul of an ancient people." The words flowed naturally, as if they'd been waiting 15 years to be spoken again. Robert realized he was quoting his favorite phrase, the same one he'd found in his former student's letter. The young intern, Jason, raised his hand. "Professor Robert, is it true that Mandarin is the hardest language in the world?" Robert smiled, remembering how many times he'd answered that same question throughout his career. "Jason, difficulty is relative. Mandarin has unique challenges, like tones and writing, but it also has simple aspects like straightforward grammar. The real difficulty lies in understanding that we're not just learning words, but a completely different way of organizing thoughts." For the next 2 hours, Robert taught basic greetings, explained the tone system, and shared stories about the origins of Chinese characters. He saw the same fascination in his students' eyes that he once saw in his university classes. As the employees left excitedly, practicing the sounds they'd learned with each other, Patricia approached. "Robert, that was incredible. You have a gift for teaching. It was my life," he said simply, "before. And it could be again, in a different way." Robert didn't answer, but for the first time in 15 years, he considered the possibility that Patricia might be right. The classes quickly became the most anticipated event of the week at the company. Robert discovered that teaching in a corporate setting had its own dynamic, different from the university. The students were more focused on practical application, less interested in linguistic theory. This forced him to adapt his methods, creating exercises based on real business situations. Li Wei, who had stayed in New York City to oversee the negotiations, asked to attend one of the classes. Robert was nervous about the Chinese executive's presence, but Li Wei behaved like a respectful student, taking notes and participating in the exercises. After class, Li Wei made an observation that surprised Robert. "Professor, you teach Mandarin the way a Chinese person would teach English. He understands the mental structure of the language, not just grammar rules." "How so?" "Many foreign teachers teach Mandarin as if it were English with different characters. You teach it as if it were a portal to another way of thinking." The compliment touched Robert deeply. Over his years of research, he had developed a unique methodology based on the idea that each language represented a distinct worldview. Teaching Mandarin to him meant teaching students to think like the Chinese, not just memorize vocabulary. But the success of his classes also brought unexpected pressures. Michael suggested that Robert leave his job as a janitor to dedicate himself fully to teaching. He offered a salary 3 times higher and the title of Senior Cultural Consultant. "I can't accept, Mr. Thompson," Robert said politely. "Why not? You're wasting your talent cleaning bathrooms." The remark stung, not because it implied cleaning was inferior work, but because Robert knew, in part, Michael was right. He was underutilizing knowledge that could benefit far more people. Cleaning brings me peace, he explained, and I don't want teaching to become an obligation again. When I was a university professor, there were pressures, bureaucracies, academic politics. Now I teach because I want to, when I want to, how I want to, Michael insisted. But Robert stood firm. Still, the proposal planted a seed of doubt. Would it really be a waste to continue as a janitor? Was he wasting a chance to honor Mary and Emily's memory by sharing the knowledge he had acquired for them? The answer came unexpectedly during a negotiation with the Chinese delegation. A deadlock had arisen over intellectual property, a concept interpreted very differently in their two cultures. The official translator struggled to explain the nuances, creating more confusion than clarity. Robert was cleaning the nearby hallway when he heard the discussion escalate. On impulse, he entered the room and asked permission to intervene. The problem here is conceptual, he told both sides. For the Chinese, knowledge belongs to the collective. It should be shared for everyone's benefit. For Americans, knowledge is individual property. It must be protected to ensure the creator is rewarded. Li Wei nodded vigorously, relieved someone finally understood the Chinese perspective. Michael, too, seemed relieved to hear the Chinese position explained clearly. How do we resolve this? Patricia asked. Robert thought for a moment, recalling similar cases from his doctoral studies. We create a hybrid model. Intellectual property is protected for a limited time, after which it becomes shared. That way the creator has initial exclusivity to recoup their investment, but the knowledge eventually benefits the whole community. The solution pleased both sides. Li Wei remarked in Mandarin that Robert had found harmony between two seemingly incompatible philosophies. Michael again offered him the permanent consultant position. Once more, Robert refused, but now he understood why everyone insisted so much. It wasn't just about professional recognition, it was about social responsibility. His knowledge could foster understanding between cultures, building bridges where walls once stood. That night, after his weekly class, Robert found himself alone in the training room, gazing at the board filled with Chinese characters he had written to explain cultural differences. He remembered Mary attending his university lectures, always fascinated by how he transformed unfamiliar symbols into understandable stories. "Robert," she used to say, "you don't teach languages. You teach people to dream in other tongues." The memory brought tears, but also clarity. Mary had understood better than anyone the true purpose of her work. It wasn't about grammar or vocabulary, but about expanding human horizons. The following week, Robert sought out Mrs. Jenkins during lunch break. "Jenkins, I need to talk to you." "Of course, dear. What's going on?" "I'm thinking about accepting the consultant position Michael offered." Mrs. Jenkins stopped eating and looked at him intently. "And what's stopping you?" "Fear. Fear that accepting it means abandoning the Robert who saved me these past 15 years. "Robert, dear, you're not abandoning anyone. You're evolving. The person who saved you 15 years ago did their job. Now it's time for the next version to emerge. What if I can't do it? What if it's too hard? Then you go back to maintenance. Your job will still be here no matter what you decide." Michael guaranteed me that. The conversation with Mrs. Jenkins was decisive. Robert realized he was clinging to an identity that, while it had served an important role in his recovery, no longer fit his life's purpose. The next day, he went to Michael's office. "Mr. Thompson, about the consultant proposal." Michael looked up, hopeful. "I accept, but with specific conditions." "Go ahead." "I keep living in the same apartment in the same neighborhood. I don't want drastic changes in my personal life. Second, I keep the volunteer classes for the staff. Third, I can decline projects that don't interest me. And fourth, if at any point I feel it's not working, I can return to maintenance without any awkwardness." "I accept all your conditions," Michael said immediately. "When do you want to start?" "Next week." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The transition from maintenance worker to cultural consultant was smoother than Robert had imagined. He kept some habits from his old routine, arriving early to organize his new office, with the same meticulous care he once used to clean hallways. The difference was that now he organized ideas instead of objects, built strategies instead of cleaning schedules. His first official project was developing a cultural protocol for all the company's future negotiations with Asian partners. Robert created a detailed manual explaining not just linguistic matters, but business etiquette, concepts of time, hierarchy, and decision-making across different Eastern cultures. Li Wei was so impressed with the work that he suggested Robert write a book on intercultural negotiations. The idea initially frightened Robert. Writing meant reclaiming the academic identity he had abandoned. But the more he thought about it, the more he saw it as a way to honor Mary and Emily, sharing the knowledge he'd gained over the years they had supported him unconditionally. During this time, the volunteer classes continued to thrive. The initial group of 15 employees grew to 25, including people from other departments who had heard about the maintenance professor. Robert adapted the curriculum to accommodate different levels, creating beginner and advanced classes. One of the most dedicated students was Jason, the young intern. The son of Bolivian immigrants, he intuitively understood the challenges of navigating between different cultures. His questions were always sharp, pushing Robert to deepen his explanations and rethink his teaching methods. "Professor Robert," Jason said after a particularly complex lesson on Chinese writing, "have you ever thought about going back to the university?" The question caught Robert off guard. "What do you mean?" "Teaching at the university again. You teach better than any professor I've ever had." "Jason, university is a very different environment from here. There are politics, bureaucracies, pressures, but you could reach so many more people, train new teachers, influence generations." Robert grew thoughtful. For 15 years, he had avoided any contact with the academic world, treating it as forbidden territory filled with painful memories. But Jason's words planted a seed that slowly began to sprout. Robert's life began to change in other ways too. His reputation as a cultural mediator spread beyond Thomson Technology. Other companies started seeking him out for consulting work. The Chinese embassy in the United States invited him to speak about trade relations between the two countries. Each new invitation represented another step outside the comfort zone he had so carefully built. Robert accepted some, declined others, always cautious not to overwhelm himself emotionally. During one of these talks at the embassy, he met Dr. Chen Wei, a cultural attaché who had read his old academic papers. Dr. Chen made an observation that would shift Robert's thoughts. "Professor Robert, your work on linguistic evolution is still cited in Chinese universities today. An entire generation of linguists has been influenced by your theories." "That was a long time ago," Robert replied uncomfortably. "Knowledge doesn't age, Professor. It evolves. Your ideas planted seeds that are still growing." The conversation with Dr. Chen gave Robert a perspective he hadn't considered. For 15 years, he had thought of his academic career as a closed chapter, buried along with his family. But perhaps it was possible to reclaim some parts without reliving all the pain. That night, Robert did something he hadn't done in years. He accessed academic databases to check citations of his old work. He discovered Dr. Chen was right. His articles on Sino-Tibetan dialects were required reading in linguistics courses worldwide. His theories on semantic evolution had inspired research at universities across 5 continents. He felt pride mixed with melancholy. All that recognition had continued growing while he cleaned bathrooms, unaware of the lasting impact of his work. Mary would have been proud. Emily, who had dreamed of being a teacher like her father, would have been fascinated to know his ideas had crossed oceans. The revelation motivated Robert to seriously consider Li Wei's suggestion about writing a book. It would be a way to update his old theories, applying them to contemporary contexts of globalization and international business. He began by writing a few experimental pages just to see if he could still articulate academic thoughts coherently. To his surprise, the words flowed naturally, as if they had been waiting 15 years to be set free. The book project became a positive obsession. Robert spent late nights writing, researching, connecting old theories with recent observations. He realized his experience as a janitor had given him a unique perspective on human dynamics. Watching people unnoticed for 15 years had taught him lessons about behavior no university classroom could offer. Patricia noticed the change in Robert. He seemed more energized, more engaged, more like the person he should have been all those years. During one of their regular conversations, she made an observation that surprised him. "You're becoming yourself again." "What do you mean?" "In the early years you seemed faded, like a shadow of a person. Now, there's light in your eyes again." Robert considered Patricia's words. It was true, he felt different, more connected to himself and the world around him. But it wasn't about going back to being someone, but rather integrating all versions of himself: the academic, the janitor, the teacher, the survivor. The book was nearly finished when Robert received an unexpected invitation. New York University, where he had worked before the accident, invited him to give a lecture at the International Linguistics Conference. The topic: Evolution of Linguistic Theories in the Age of Globalization. Robert froze as he read the invitation. Returning to NYU meant physically confronting the place where his former life had unfolded. It meant walking the same halls where Mary used to wait for him, seeing the same room where Emily played while he prepared lessons. For weeks, Robert avoided responding to the invitation, but conversations with Mrs. Jenkins, Lee Wei, and Patricia gradually convinced him that perhaps it was time to take this step. "Robert," Mrs. Jenkins said, "you've spent 15 years running from that place. Maybe it's time to make peace with it. What if it's too hard? Then you leave, simple as that. But what if it's liberating?" The possibility of liberation was tempting. Robert realized he had reached a point where avoiding the past required more energy than confronting it. He accepted the invitation. The day of the lecture arrived on a sunny April Sunday. Robert chose to take the subway to the university, following the same route he had taken 20 years earlier. Each station brought memories. Here he used to buy flowers for Mary on Fridays. There Emily had seen a violinist playing for the first time. As he entered the campus, Robert felt a mix of nostalgia and anxiety. Everything seemed smaller than he remembered, yet brimming with emotional significance. His steps automatically led him to the building where his old office had been. To his surprise, he found a plaque on the door: Professor Robert Johnson Smith, Applied Linguistics. He discovered the room had been kept in his name all those years as a tribute to his academic contributions. The discovery moved him deeply. For 15 years, he had believed his time at the university had been forgotten, that his sudden absence had left only administrative inconveniences. But here was proof that he had touched lives, that his work had been valued even after his departure. The lecture hall was packed. Robert recognized some faces: colleagues who had aged, former students, now professors, researchers who knew his work only through citations. His presentation was about how his old theories could be applied to contemporary challenges of global communication. During the lecture, Robert felt completely in his element. The words flowed naturally, the ideas connected clearly, and the audience responded with genuine enthusiasm. For an hour and a half, he was once again the professor he had been, but enriched by the wisdom gained through years of simplicity and reflection. After the presentation, Robert was surrounded by admirers, colleagues, and curious students. Many wanted to know about his years of absence. Others were interested in his updated theories. He answered honestly about his journey, explaining how pain had led him to rediscover purpose through humble work. A young professor approached and said something that touched Robert deeply. "Professor, I read all your papers during my doctorate. They changed how I understand language. It's an honor to finally meet you in person." Robert realized his work had continued to impact people even during his years of isolation. His ideas had taken on a life of their own, inspiring a new generation of researchers he had never met. At the end of the event, Robert visited Mary and Emily's graves for the first time in 15 years. He took 2 bamboo saplings, plants that symbolized resilience in Chinese culture. There, he silently spoke to them, sharing his journey, his discoveries, his gradual return to life. "Mary," he whispered, "I think I finally understand what you meant about teaching people to dream in other languages. It's not just about languages, but about expanding human possibilities. Emily, Daddy is teaching again, and this time I know you'd both be proud." The visit to the grave was cathartic. Robert felt as if he had finally been given permission to move forward, honoring his family's memory not through self-punishment, but by continuing the work he loved. In the weeks that followed, Robert received several offers to return to academia. Universities offered professorships, publishers wanted to release his work, and international organizations invited him as a consultant. For the first time in 15 years, he had to choose between multiple opportunities rather than simply taking any available job. He decided to accept a visiting professor position at NYU, committing to one course per semester while maintaining his consulting work at Thomson Technology. It was a way to balance academia with practical application, theory with real-world experience. His first university course in 15 years was on intercultural communication in global business. The class was diverse, students of linguistics, business, international relations, and economics. Robert applied everything he had learned during his consulting work, creating an environment where theory and practice complemented each other perfectly. One of his students was the grandson of Li Wei, a young man studying business who dreamed of expanding his family's ventures to the United States. During a lesson on cultural nuances in negotiations, the young man remarked, "Professor, my grandfather said you're the person who best understands our culture outside of China." Robert smiled, remembering Li Wei. "Your grandfather taught me a great deal too. Cultural understanding is a two-way street." The success of the course led to other opportunities. Robert was invited to conduct workshops at companies, speak at international conferences, and participate in cultural exchange programs. His schedule gradually became as full as it had been 20 years earlier, but with one key difference: he now had control over his choices. During this time, Robert stayed in close contact with the original group of Thomson employees who had learned Mandarin with him. Many had become proficient enough to handle basic negotiations without translators. Jason, the young intern, had been promoted and now led the company's international relations department. "Professor Robert," Jason said during one of their sessions, "you changed my life. Before, I was just an intern filing papers. Now I'm negotiating contracts with Asian companies." "Jason, I just gave you some tools. You did all the work of learning and applying them. But you did more than that. You taught me that language barriers are actually opportunities for connection." Jason's observation reflected the philosophy Robert had developed over the years. Cultural differences weren't obstacles to overcome, but bridges to build. Every misunderstanding was a chance to deepen mutual understanding. Robert's book was finally published under the title Linguistic Bridges: Navigating Cultures in a Globalized World. The work combined academic rigor with practical cases, linguistic theories with anecdotes from real negotiations. It quickly became a reference in MBA programs and international relations courses. During the book launch, Michael Thompson gave an emotional speech. "Robert Johnson Smith revolutionized our company in two ways. First, as a custodian who cared for our physical space with unmatched dedication. Second, as a consultant who taught us to tend to our cultural relationships with the same devotion." He proves that greatness comes not from titles but from character. The launch ceremony brought together people from every chapter of Robert's life: academic colleagues, Thomson Technology employees, Chinese executives, former university students, and the company's first Mandarin learners. Seeing all these people in one room was a revelation for Robert, showing how his journey had touched so many diverse lives. Li Wei, who had become a close friend, made a special remark during the event. "Professor Robert taught me that true wisdom comes from the ability to start anew. He lost everything but found a way to turn pain into a bridge for human connection." During the book's promotional period, Robert traveled to several cities across the United States to give lectures. In each place, he met people whose lives had been unexpectedly touched by his ideas. A business owner in Chicago had used concepts from the book to improve relationships with immigrant employees. A teacher in Boston adapted his techniques to teach English to refugees. The biggest surprise came when Robert received an invitation to teach a course at Beijing University, where he had presented research 20 years earlier on the trip that had indirectly led to his family's fatal accident. Accepting would mean confronting the last ghost of his past. Robert hesitated for weeks. Returning to Beijing would close a circle that had begun in tragedy, but it could also transform a place of trauma into one of renewal. He decided to accept, but on one condition: he would make the trip accompanied by Mrs. Jenkins, his emotional anchor through all those difficult years. She had become more than a friend. She was chosen family, the one who had witnessed and supported every step of his recovery. The trip to Beijing was revealing. Robert found a transformed city, though some places remained just as he remembered. Walking the streets he had trodden 20 years earlier brought back memories of Mary and Emily. But now those recollections came with peace rather than piercing pain. During his university course, Robert spoke about resilience through simplicity, finding purpose in humble work, and turning loss into an opportunity to serve others. His message resonated deeply with the Chinese audience, who valued concepts of humility and personal renewal. One of the Chinese professors remarked after the lecture, "Professor Robert, your journey embodies an ancient Chinese proverb: falling is not failure, failure is staying down." Robert nodded, recognizing the profound truth in those words. For 15 years, he had thought accepting work as a custodian was giving up on himself, but in reality, it had been the first step in a long process of rebuilding that led him to a better place than before. On his last day in Beijing, Robert visited the temple where he had gone with Mary during their honeymoon. He lit incense in memory of her and Emily, thanking them for their time together and asking for blessings to continue honoring their memories through meaningful work. Back in the United States, Robert found a new proposal waiting: to lead an international center for linguistic studies, a partnership between NYU and Chinese universities. It would be a role combining research, teaching, and practical application in a unique way. Before deciding, Robert gathered the people who had been pivotal in his journey. Mrs. Jenkins, now 70, encouraged him to accept. Patricia assured him he would always have a place at Thompson Technology whenever he wanted. Li Wei offered full support from the Chinese business community in the United States. But the most important conversation was with Jason, who had become a symbol of how education can transform lives. During a simple lunch, Jason made an observation that helped Robert decide, "Professor, you always said that language is the soul of a people. The center you're proposing would be a place where souls meet." Robert accepted the position, but insisted on specific conditions. He would keep his modest apartment on the Upper East Side, continue volunteering to teach classes for Thompson Technology employees, and reserve time to write about practical applications of linguistic studies. The center opened 2 years later, becoming a global reference for intercultural communication. Robert developed innovative programs that combined academic rigor with business applications, linguistic theory with real human experience. During the inauguration ceremony, Robert gave a speech that summed up his life philosophy. "I've learned that greatness doesn't come from avoiding falls, but from turning every fall into a step to climb higher. For 15 years I thought I was lost, but in truth I was preparing to find my true purpose, building bridges where others see walls." The audience, which included dignitaries from various countries, university students, and Thompson Technology employees, gave him a standing ovation. Mrs. Jenkins, seated in the front row, wiped away tears of pride. After the ceremony, Robert walked through the halls of the new center, watching students from different nationalities working together, overcoming language barriers through mutual understanding. In them, he saw a reflection of his own journey, people willing to step out of their comfort zones to find deeper connections. At the end of the day, Robert returned to his apartment on the Upper East Side, brewed green tea as he had learned to do during years of studying Chinese culture, and sat down to write in the journal he had kept since his first volunteer class at Thompson. "Today," he wrote, "I realized I never stopped being a teacher. I just changed classrooms. For 15 years, the whole world was my university, and every person I met was both my student and my teacher. Mary and Emily would be proud, not just of what I've achieved, but of how I've achieved it. One step at a time, one word at a time, one bridge at a time." Robert closed the journal and looked out the window. Outside, New York City pulsed with the energy of millions of people, each carrying unique stories, private dreams, and personal challenges. Tomorrow, he would return to the center to continue his work of building bridges between different worlds. The end of the story. And you? What did you think of Robert's journey? Could you see how a devastating loss could transform into the discovery of renewed purpose? Tell us in the comments which part of the story moved you the most, and if you know someone who, like Robert, found strength in simplicity to rebuild their life. Your opinion is very valuable to us.